Welcome to Part 7 of the Cartwright Murder. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 31. With the thrill of the discovery still buzzing in me, I trudged home under the stars, my shoes soaked and my skirt a mess. I managed to sneak upstairs and change without waking Emily, yet I was utterly exhausted. My biggest dilemma was what to do with my boots. There didn't seem to be a single safe spot in the house away from Emily's notice. Finally, I decided I'd go up the next morning and drop them into the hole that the ghost had made in the trunk room wall. I fell asleep almost immediately after making that plan, and in my dreams I relived the night's events. I found myself once again among the group surrounding the silent figure on the grass, and like before, I heard Alex's voice, tense and triumphant. "Then we've got them," he said, but in my dreams his words echoed over and over until it felt like he was yelling in my ears. I woke up early, despite my fatigue, and lay there deep in thought. Who was Alex? I no longer believed he was just a gardener. Who was the man whose body we had unearthed? And where was Paul Cartwright? Likely living somewhere safe, shielded from extradition, enjoying the fortune he'd stolen. Did Louise and her mother know about the scandalous deception? What did Thomas know, and what about Mrs. Watson? Who was Nina Carrington? That last question felt like it had some clarity. Somehow, the woman had found out about the switch and tried to use that knowledge for blackmail. Nina Carrington's own story died with her, but it was evident she had passed on her knowledge to Michael the afternoon Clare, and I was searching for clues about the man I shot on the east veranda. Michael had been frantic after what he heard. It was clear that Louise was marrying Dr. Walker to protect the shameful secret for her mother's sake. Michael, ever reckless, had rushed to confront Dr. Walker and denounced him. There had been quite a scene, and he left to head to the station to meet and inform Mr. Hartley had shared his discoveries with me. The doctor was sharp both in thought and action, accompanied, perhaps, by Riggs, who had shown a lack of scruples until he had a falling out with his boss. He had gone over to the railroad embankment, and by stepping directly in front of the train, had forced Michael to swerve. The rest of the story was known to us. This was my reconstruction of that afternoon and evening. It was nearly accurate, but not entirely. That morning, a telegram had arrived from Claire. "Michael is awake and getting better. He'll probably be home in a day or so. Gertrude." With Michael safe and on the mend, and at long last something solid to focus on, I began that Thursday with renewed determination. As Mr. Hartley had pointed out, things were coming together. Little did we know that I was on the verge of being caught and nearly wrapped up in it all. I woke up late, lying in bed and surveying the four walls of my room, trying to picture where a secret chamber might be hidden behind them. During the daytime, Sunnyside truly lived up to its name. No house was more bright and welcoming, appearing anything but sinister. Every corner seemed transparent and straightforward, yet I firmly believed there was a concealed room somewhere behind its elegantly wallpapered walls, holding all kinds of potential. I made a mental note to measure the house during the day to spot any differences between the outer and inner walls. I recalled once more the exact phrase from the piece of paper Hartley had found. The note simply mentioned chimney. It was the only clue, and a house as expansive as Sunnyside was bound to have many. There was an open fireplace in my dressing room, but none in my bedroom. As I lay there looking around, a thought struck me, making me sit up abruptly. The trunk room right above me had an open fireplace and a brick chimney, yet there was nothing like that in my room. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and closely examined the wall opposite me. There was clearly no flue, and I was certain there wasn't one in the hall just below. The house was heated by steam, as I had mentioned earlier. In the living room, a large open fireplace stood, but it was on the opposite side. Why did the trunk room have both a radiator and an open fireplace? Architects weren't typically this disorganized. Not even 15 minutes had passed before I found myself upstairs with a tape measure instead of a ruler, eager to prove Mr. Hartley right about my intellect, and firmly resolved to keep my suspicions to myself until I had more than just a hunch to support them. The hole in the trunk room wall still gaped between the chimney and the outer wall. I examined it once more, but with no new findings. However, the space between the brick wall and the plaster and lath wall took on new importance. Hole revealed only one side of the chimney, so I decided to investigate what lay on the other side of the mantel. I worked with urgency. Emily had gone to the village market, firmly believing that the shopkeepers would cheat her on the scale unless she was watching closely, especially since the collapse of the Traders' Bank meant we had to be extra careful with our resources. I knew I had to finish before she returned. Lacking proper tools, I rummaged around and found a pair of garden scissors and a hatchet. With those in hand, I began my task. The plaster came off easily, but the lathing was more stubborn. It yielded under the strikes, only to snap back into place again, and needing to be cautious made it twice as frustrating. My palm developed a blister before the hatchet finally broke through, falling with a bang that sounded like a gunshot to my frayed nerves. I sat on a trunk, waiting for Emily to come rushing up the stairs, the rest of the household trailing after her like the tail of a comet. But nothing happened, and with a growing sense of unease, I continued to enlarge the opening. The outcome was utterly disappointing. When I held a lit candle to the opening, I could see exactly what I had observed on the other side of the chimney, a space between the real wall and the false one, perhaps 7 feet long and about 3 feet wide. It was in no way a secret chamber, and it was clear it hadn't been touched since the house was built. This was a huge letdown. Mr. Hartley had believed that if there was a hidden room, it would be located near the circular staircase. In fact, I knew he had once explored the entire length of the clothes chute while hanging from a rope, looking for it. Just as I was about to admit he was right, my gaze settled on the mantel and fireplace. The fireplace hadn't been used at all. It was blocked with a metal front, and when the front refused to budge, revealing it was never meant to be moved, my spirits lifted. I rushed into the next room. Sure enough, there was another mantel and fireplace, similarly sealed off. In both rooms, the chimney flue jutted out significantly from the wall. I measured with a tape, my hands shaking so much I could hardly hold it steady. The flues extended 2.5 feet into each room, and with the 3 feet in between the two walls, that added up to 8 feet accounted for. 8 feet in one direction and almost 7 in the other. What a chimney it was. But I had only found the hidden room. I wasn't inside it. No amount of pressing on the intricately carved wooden mantels, searching the floors for loose boards, or trying any of the usual methods yielded results. I was certain there had to be a way in, probably a simple one. But what would I find if I got inside? Was the detective correct, and were the barns and money from the Traders' Bank hidden there? Or was our entire theory flawed? Wouldn't Paul Cartwright have taken his loot with him? If he didn't, and if Dr. Walker was in on it, he would have known how to access the chimney room. So who had created the other opening in the false partition? Chapter 32. Emily burst into the room during lunch, her eyes wide with terror. She declared she had found a fresh hole in the wall of the trunk room and rushed down the stairs, shrieking. She insisted that as she stepped inside, she felt unseen hands working at the plaster, and when she entered, they stopped, leaving behind a cold, damp breeze. To prove her point, she held out my wet and muddy boots, which I had foolishly forgotten to hide, to the detective and me. "What did I tell you?" she exclaimed dramatically. "Look at them. They're yours, Miss Maggie, filthy and soaked all the way through. You can laugh all you want, but something has definitely been wearing your shoes. The smell of the graveyard is all over them. How do we know they weren't wandering through the churchyard last night, sitting on the graves?" Mr. Hartley nearly choked. "I wouldn't be surprised if that's exactly what they were doing, Emily," he managed to say after catching his breath. "They certainly look like it." I sensed that the detective had a plan forming in his mind, one that was meant to be quite the revelation. But events moved rapidly, leaving no room for him to execute it. The first interruption came with a message from the charity hospital, informing me that Mrs. Watson was dying and had requested to see me. I wasn't particularly eager to go. While there's a peculiar, bittersweet pleasure to be found in a funeral's rituals and splendor, I dreaded the prospect of a deathbed scene. Nevertheless, Emily dug out the black dress and the crepe veil I kept for such occasions, and I reluctantly prepared to leave. I left Mr. Hartley and the day detective searching every inch of the circular staircase, hammering, probing, and measuring. Inside, I felt a thrill at the thought of the surprise I had planned for them that evening. Little did I know, I would shock them nearly into a fit. After arriving by train, I made my way to the charity hospital and was promptly taken to a ward. In a grey-walled room, lying in a high iron bed, was Mrs. Watson. She looked extremely fragile, only opening her eyes to meet my gaze when I took a seat next to her. Guilt washed over me. We had been so absorbed in our own lives that I had left this poor woman to face her fate without a word of compassion. The nurse administered a stimulant, and after a while she was able to speak. Yet her story came out fragmented and disjointed, so I'll recount it my own way. Within an hour of entering the charity hospital, I had listened to a sorrowful tale and witnessed a woman slip into an unconsciousness that was merely a breath away from death. Here's a brief account of the housekeeper's story. She was nearly 40, having taken on the role of both sister and mother to a large family of children. One by one, they had passed away and were buried alongside their parents in a small town in the Midwest. Only one sister remained, the youngest, Lucy. All of Anne's affectionate and impulsive love had been poured into Lucy. When Anne was 32 and Lucy was 19, a young man arrived in their town. He was headed east after spending the summer at a well-known ranch in Wyoming, a place where wealthy families sent their troublesome sons for a dose of fresh air, temperance, and hunting. The sisters were unaware of this background, and the young man's enthusiasm swept them off their feet. 7 years prior, Lucy Haswell had married a young man named Aubrey Wallace. Anne Haswell had married a local carpenter and now found herself a widow. For 3 months, life went fairly well. Aubrey took his bride to Chicago, where they stayed in a hotel. Perhaps the very innocence that had captivated him in Valley Mill grated on him in the city. Even during those 3 months, he hardly played the role of a model husband, and when he vanished, Anne felt a strange sense of relief. It was different with the young wife. She grew sad and anxious, and when she gave birth to her son, she died. Anne took the baby and named him Lucian. Having no children of her own, she poured all her maternal feelings into him. One thing Anne was determined about was that Aubrey Wallace would be the one to educate his son. Her devotion to the child drove her ambition. He must have every opportunity possible. So she journeyed east. She moved from place to place, doing simple sewing while always making a home for the boy. Eventually, she realized that her only skills were in domestic work, so she found a place for Lucian in an Episcopalian home and got a job as the housekeeper for the Cartwrights. It was here that she encountered Lucian's father, this time using his real name, Arnold Cartwright. At that time, I sensed no particular hostility from Anne. She informed him about their son and threatened to expose him if he didn't provide for the child. For a while, he did assist her, but soon he realized that Lucian was the sole focus of Anne's lonely life. He discovered where the boy was hidden and threatened to take him away. Anne was desperate. The tables turned. Where Arnold had once given money for Lucian's support, as the years passed, he began to extort money from Anne until she was always broke. The more Arnold fell from grace, the more he demanded from her. After his falling out with his family, things became even worse. Anne took Lucian from the home and hid him in a farmhouse near Casanova on the Claysburg Road. She would go there sometimes to see the boy, who had fallen ill with a fever. The farmers were Germans, and he called the farmer's wife Grossmutter. He had grown into a handsome boy, the only reason Anne had to keep going. The Cartwrights moved to California, but that only sparked Arnold's wrath once more. He was furious about the child's disappearance, and Anne feared he might harm her. She left the large house and headed down to the lodge. When I had rented Sunnyside, she believed the troubles would finally come to an end. She had applied for the role of housekeeper and had gotten the job. That was on Saturday. That night, Louise arrived unexpectedly. Thomas sent for Mrs. Watson and then went to find Arnold Cartwright at the Greenwood Club. Anne had always liked Louise. She reminded her of Lucy. Anne was unsure of the reason for the turmoil, but Louise was in a state of frantic distress. Mrs. Watson tried to avoid Arnold, but he was persistent. He left the lodge and went up to the house around 2:30, was let in through the east entrance, and quickly came out again. Something had happened, though she didn't know what. Soon after, Mr. Donovan and another gentleman departed in a car. Thomas and Anne managed to calm Louise down, and just before 3, Mrs. Watson started toward the house. Thomas had a key to the east entrance and gave it to her. As she walked across the lawn, she was confronted by Arnold, who seemed intent on getting into the house. He had picked up a golf club somewhere, and when she refused him entry, he struck her with it. One hand was badly cut, and it was that wound, which had become infected, that was slowly killing her. In a frenzy of rage and fear, she broke away and rushed into the house just as Claire and Jack Morgan were arriving at the front door. She climbed the stairs, hardly aware of what she was doing. Claire's door was open, and Michael's revolver lay on the bed. She picked it up and, turning, ran partway down the circular staircase. She heard Arnold fumbling at the lock outside. Quietly, she slipped down and opened the door. He was inside before she could make it back to the stairs. It was dark, but she could see the white of his shirt. From the 4th step, she fired. As he fell, someone in the billiard room screamed and fled. When the alarm sounded, she hadn't had a moment to make it upstairs. She took refuge in the west wing until everyone was gathered on the lower floor. Then she quietly made her way upstairs and tossed the revolver out of an upper window, returning just in time to let in the men from the Greenwood Club. If Thomas had any inkling of the truth, he never revealed it. When she noticed that Arnold's injured hand was worsening, she gave the old man the address for Lucian in Richfield, along with nearly $100. The money was meant for Lucian's care until she got better. She had sent for me, hoping I could persuade the Cartwrights to take an interest in the child. As her condition deteriorated, she wrote to Mrs. Cartwright, revealing little more than that Arnold's legitimate child was in Richfield, begging her to acknowledge him. She was dying. The boy was a Cartwright, entitled to his father's share of the estate. The papers proving her claims were tucked away in her trunk at Sunnyside, along with letters from the deceased that would confirm her story. She was on her way out of this world, not wishing to be judged by earthly laws, hoping that somewhere else Lucy might advocate for her. It was she who had crept down the circular staircase that night when Mr. Hartley overheard someone in that area. Cornered, she had fled desperately through the first door she found. She had tumbled down the clothes chute and was saved by the basket below. I could have cried with relief. It had not been Claire, after all. That was the tale. Sad and tragic though it was, sharing it seemed to bring some comfort to the dying woman. She remained unaware that Thomas was dead, and I chose not to tell her. I promised to look after little Lucian and sat with her until her moments of consciousness grew shorter and eventually faded away. She died that night. Chapter 33. I drove quickly from Casanova Station to the house in the hired carriage and spotted Detective Burns loitering across the street from the Walker residence. Hartley was now applying some pressure, but I was certain he'd be ready to crank it up further very soon. The house was quiet. 2 steps of the circular staircase had been pried off, but it didn't lead to anything. Beyond a second message from Claire, insisting that Michael insisted on returning home and that they would arrive that night, there was nothing new. Mr. Hartley, having been unable to locate the secret room, had gone to the village. I later learned that he visited Dr. Walker, claiming to suffer from acute indigestion, and before he left, he inquired about the evening trains to the city. He remarked that he had wasted a lot of time on the case, suggesting much of the mystery was just my imagination. The doctor believed the house was under constant guard. Well, when a place carries a reputation like that, it hardly needs an actual guard, as Hartley pointed out. Sure enough, late in the afternoon, the 2 private detectives, accompanied by Mr. Hartley, walked down the main street of Casanova and caught a train to the city. What they did next, getting off at the next station and walking back to Sunnyside at dusk, was not known at the time. Personally, I was unaware of either move. My mind was occupied with other matters. Emily brought me some tea while I rested from my trip, and on the tray was a small book from the Casanova library. It was called The Unseen World, and had a cheerful cover featuring half a dozen sheeted figures holding hands around a headstone. At this point in my story, Michael always quips, "Trust a woman to add 2 and 2 together, and get 6. To which I reply that if 2 and 2 plus x equals 6, discovering the unknown quantity is the easiest thing in the world. The fact that a whole house full of detectives completely overlooked it was due to their fixation on proving that 2 plus 2 equals 4. The weight of my visit to the hospital hung over me as I anticipated seeing Michael again that evening. It was around 5 o'clock when Emily left me to take a nap before dinner, having dressed me in a soft grey silk robe and a pair of slippers. I listened to her footsteps fade away, and as soon as I knew she was safely downstairs, I headed up to the trunk room. Everything was just as I'd left it, and I immediately set to work trying to find the entrance to the hidden room. The spaces on either side, as I mentioned, revealed only a few feet of brick wall. There was no sign of an entrance, no levers, no hinges, nothing to suggest a way in. I considered the mantel or the roof, and after half an hour of fruitless searching at the mantel, I decided to check the roof. I've never been fond of heights. Each time I've climbed a step ladder, it's left me feeling dizzy and weak. The top of the Washington Monument feels as unreachable to me as the presidential chair. Yet, strangely, I climbed out onto the Sunnyside roof without a moment's hesitation. Like a hound on the scent, driven by the thrill of the chase and the fervour of pursuit, I felt a rush of exhilaration as I made my way from the unfinished ballroom through a window onto the roof of the east wing, which stood only 2 stories high. Once on the roof, I spotted a small vertical iron ladder attached to the wall of the ballroom, leading up to the main building. It looked easy from below, but climbing those 12 feet proved to be quite a challenge. I wrapped my silk dress tightly around me and finally made it to the top of the ladder. Once there, I was completely out of breath. I sat down on the top rung, resting my feet, and secured my hairpins while the wind blew my dressing gown out like a sail. I had torn a long strip of silk loose, and with determination, I yanked it free and tied it around my head. From far below, even the smallest sounds carried up to me with surprising clarity. I could hear the paper boy whistling as he made his way down the drive, but then I heard something else. A stone hit the ground, followed by a startled cry from Beulah. Forgetting my fear of heights, I moved boldly toward the edge of the roof. It was 6:30, and the sky was starting to dim. "Hey, you down there," I called. The paper boy looked around, confused. After a moment, he finally spotted me and froze for a second, then let out a terrified scream. He dropped his papers and sprinted across the lawn toward the road without even glancing back. He tripped once, tumbling head over heels, but was back on his feet in an instant. He cleared the hedge in a single leap, something I was certain would have been a challenge for anyone else under normal circumstances. I was relieved to put to rest the tale of the Grey Lady, a favorite story in Casanova. I believed the local wisdom was that it was always unlucky to throw a stone at a black cat. With Johnny Sweeney kicking up dust down the road and dinner time approaching, I continued my exploration. Thankfully, the roof was flat, which allowed me to carefully examine every inch of it. But the outcome was underwhelming. No secret trapdoor appeared, no glass window, just a couple of pipes about 2 inches wide, standing perhaps 18 inches tall and spaced 3 feet apart, capped to keep the rain out while allowing air to flow through. I picked up a pebble from the roof and dropped it down, leaning my ear against one of the pipes. I could hear it hit something with a sharp, metallic sound, but I couldn't tell how far it had fallen. Eventually, I gave up and descended the ladder again, slipping through the ballroom window unnoticed. I hurried back to the trunk room, and sitting on a box, I steeled myself to think through the puzzle at hand. If the pipes in the roof were indeed ventilators to the secret room, and no trapdoor existed above, then the entrance must be hidden in one of the 2 rooms it connected to, unless, of course, the room had been constructed and then sealed off with a wall of bricks and mortar. Mantel caught my attention. Made of intricately carved wood, the longer I looked at it, the more I questioned how I had overlooked the oddity of such a mantel in this setting. It was adorned with scrolls and panels, and by sheer chance, I nudged one of the panels aside. It moved smoothly, revealing a small brass knob. There's no need to describe the swings of hope and dread, along with a tinge of fear over what lay beyond, as I twisted and turned the knob. It moved, but nothing seemed to happen at first. Then I realized what was wrong. I pushed the knob firmly to one side, and the entire mantel swung away from the wall nearly a foot, exposing a deep, dark space beyond. I took a deep breath, closed the door from the trunk room into the hall. Thankfully, I hadn't locked it, and pulling the mantel door wide open, I stepped into the chimney room. I caught a brief glimpse of a small portable safe, a simple wooden table, and a chair before the mantel door swung shut with a click behind me. For a moment, I stood frozen in the darkness, struggling to understand what had just happened. Then I turned and pounded frantically on the door with my fists. It was locked tight again, and in the darkness, my fingers glided over a smooth wooden surface without finding a handle. Rage boiled within me, at myself, at the mantel door, at everything around me. I didn't fear suffocating. Before that worry crossed my mind, I noticed a faint glow from the two small vents in the ceiling. They brought in air, but nothing more. The room was engulfed in blackness. I sank into the stiff-backed chair, trying to calculate how many days one could survive without food or water. When that became tedious and slightly painful, I stood up, and following the time-honored practice of those trapped in unknown, pitch-black confinement, I felt my way around the space. It was small, thankfully. All I could touch was the rough surface of the boards. In my attempts to return to the chair, I accidentally struck something that hit me squarely in the face, crashing to the ground with a sound like 1,000 explosions. Once I collected myself, I saw it had been the bulb of a swinging electric light, and had it not been for that mishap, I might have passed away in a brightly lit tomb. I must have dozed off. I know I didn't faint. I was more composed than ever. I even remember thinking about who would inherit my belongings if I were never found. I knew Emily would want my heliotrope poplin, though she looks dreadful in lavender. A few times I heard mice scurrying in the walls, so I perched on the table, my feet resting on the chair. I thought I could hear the search continuing throughout the house, and when someone entered the trunk room, I could clearly hear footsteps. "In the chimney! In the chimney!" I shouted with all my strength, and was met with a sharp scream from Emily and the sound of the trunk room door slamming shut. I felt a bit more at ease after that, even though the room was uncomfortably hot and exhausting. I figured the search for me would now take a more promising turn, and soon after I drifted into a light sleep. I had no idea how long I had been out. It must have been several hours. I was worn out from a long day, and I woke up stiff from my awkward position. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was, and my head felt heavy and foggy. Gradually I became aware of my surroundings and realized that despite the ventilators, the air was stale and getting worse. I was taking long, shallow breaths, and my face felt damp and clammy. I must have been in that room for quite a while the searchers were likely scouring the outside of the house, dredging the creek, or combing through the woods. I knew that if I stayed there another hour or two, I'd lose consciousness, and with my inability to call out, I would forfeit my only chance of rescue. It had to be the combination of poor air and heat, with the inadequate ventilation only slightly improving through the pipes. I tried to keep myself aware by pacing the length of the room repeatedly, but I lacked the strength to keep it up, so I slumped back onto the table, my back against the wall. The house was eerily quiet. At one point, my strained ears thought they detected a footstep beneath me, possibly in my own room. I reached for the chair from the table and banged it against the floor with desperation. But nothing happened. I bitterly realized that if the sound was heard at all, it was likely dismissed as one of the recent odd noises that had disturbed us. It was impossible to tell how much time had passed. I counted the minutes by monitoring my pulse, estimating it at 72 beats per minute. But time dragged on endlessly, and as I neared the end, I found it hard to keep track. My mind felt foggy. Then I heard noises coming from downstairs in the house. There was a strange, throbbing, vibrating sound that I felt more than heard, much like the distant rumble of fire engines in the city. In that terrifying moment, I thought the house was on fire, and a rush of panic surged through me. But then I realized it was just the engine of the automobile. Michael had returned. A flicker of hope ignited within me. Michael's rational mind and Claire's intuition might achieve what Emily's panic and the three detectives could not. After a time, I was sure I wasn't mistaken. Something was definitely happening below. Doors were slamming, people were moving quickly through the hallways, and the high-pitched notes of excited voices cut through the silence around me. I wished they would come closer, but eventually the sounds faded away, leaving me alone in the oppressive heat and thick darkness, feeling as if the walls were closing in on me. The first sign I had of trouble was a quiet fumbling at the lock of the mantel door. Just as I opened my mouth to scream, I froze. Maybe it was heightened awareness or instinct kicking in. Whatever it was, I remained still while someone outside ran their fingers over the carved detail of the mantel and found the hidden panel. The noise from below grew louder. I could tell a group was rushing up the stairs, and as they drew nearer, I could hear their voices clearly. "Watch the end staircases," Hartley shouted. "Damn, there's no light in here." And then a moment later he called out, "All together now. 1, 2, 3. The door to the trunk room had been locked from the inside. At the moment the door gave way, crashing open against the wall and clearly sending someone tumbling into the room. A pair of stealthy fingers maneuvered the knob with skill, causing the door to swing fully open and then shut again. Usually, Emily would scream and cover her ears at this point, but now I wasn't alone in the fireplace room. Someone else was in the darkness, breathing heavily, so close I could have reached out and touched him. I was frozen with fear. Outside, voices were filled with excitement and disbelief. The trunks were being thrown around in a frantic search, windows flung open to reveal a sheer drop of 40 feet. The man in the room with me leaned against the mantel door, listening intently. His pursuers were clearly puzzled. I could hear him take a deep breath and then fumble his way through the dark. When his hand brushed against mine, it was cold and clammy, like the touch of death itself, just a hand in an empty room. He gasped, a sound of terror that seemed to collapse in his chest. Other than jerking his hand away, he didn't move. I think sheer terror had him in its grip. He stepped back, inching away from the dread lurking in the corner, and I doubt he drew another breath. But with that space opening between us, I screamed, a piercing, frantic sound that echoed outside. "There's someone in the chimney," I cried. "Behind the mantel, the mantel." With a curse, the figure lunged across the room at me, and I screamed again. In his blind rage, he missed me. I heard him slam into the wall. In that moment, I managed to evade him. I dashed across the room and grabbed a chair. He paused briefly, listening, and then charged again, but I swung my makeshift weapon at him. It seemed to stun him, giving me a fleeting moment to catch my breath as someone shouted from outside, "We can't get in." "How does it start?" But the man in the room had shifted his approach. I could feel him closing in on me bit by bit, yet I couldn't tell from which direction. And then he had me. He covered my mouth with his hand, and I bit him hard. I was trapped, gasping for air, while someone outside was trying to break into the mantel. It was beginning to give way, for a thin wedge of yellowish light seeped through to the opposite wall. When he saw it, my attacker cursed and let me go. Then the wall swung open silently, closed again without a sound, and I was left alone. The intruder had vanished. "In the next room," I shouted desperately. "The next room," but the sound of blows against the mantel drowned out my voice. By the time I had managed to alert them, a couple of minutes had passed. Everyone joined in the pursuit except Alex, who was determined to free me. When I stepped into the trunk room, feeling like a free woman again, I could hear the commotion far below. I must say, despite Alex's eagerness to rescue me, he seemed to pay little attention to my situation. He leaped through the opening into the secret room and grabbed the portable safe. "I'm going to put this in Mr. Michael's room, Miss Donovan," he said, "and I'll send one of the detectives to keep watch over it." I barely heard him. I felt a mix of laughter and tears bubbling up inside me. I longed to crawl into bed, sip a cup of tea, scold Emily, and do all the everyday things I never thought I'd have the chance to do again. And the air, the refreshing night breeze on my face. As Alex and I reached the second floor, we encountered Mr. Hartley. He looked serious and calm, and he nodded with understanding when he spotted the safe. "Would you come with me for a moment, Miss Donovan?" he asked in a serious tone. Once I agreed, he led the way to the east wing. Lights flickered below, and several of the maids stood there, staring in disbelief. They screamed when they noticed me, stepping back to make way. A hush fell over the scene. Alex, behind me, muttered something I didn't catch and pushed past me. That's when I noticed a man crumpled at the bottom of the staircase, and Alex bent over him. As I descended slowly, Winters moved aside, and Alex straightened up, locking eyes with me over the man's body, his expression unreadable. In his hand was a ragged grey wig, and sprawled on the floor was Paul Cartwright, the man whose headstone marked the grave in Casanova churchyard. Winters relayed the grim details in a few short sentences. In his frantic rush down the spiral staircase, with Winters right behind him, Paul Cartwright had stumbled forward, hit his head against the door to the east veranda, and likely broken his neck. He had died just as Winters arrived at his side. As the detective finished speaking, I caught sight of Michael, pale and shaken, standing in the doorway of the card room. For the first time that night, I lost my composure. I wrapped my arms around my boy, and for a brief moment he had to hold me up. A second later, though, over Michael's shoulder, I saw something that shifted my feelings entirely. In the dim light of the card room, Claire and Alex, the gardener, were locked in an embrace. There's no other way to say it. He was kissing her. I was at a loss for words. Twice I opened my mouth to speak, but instead I turned Michael around and pointed. They remained blissfully unaware of us. Claire's head rested on his shoulder, his face buried in her hair. It was Mr. Hartley who disrupted the moment. He approached Alex and lightly touched his arm. "And now," he said calmly, "how much longer are you, and are going to keep up our little charade, Mr. Morgan?" Chapter 34. The news of Dr. Walker's daring escape to South America that night, along with the recovery of over $1 million in cash and securities stashed away in the safe within the chimney room, has kept the public buzzing. Yet, the details of my contribution in uncovering the secret chamber remain largely untold. The press has focused on Mr. Hartley, giving him credit that he deserves, to an extent. But if Jack Morgan, who went by Alex, hadn't followed the trail to Michael and insisted on digging up Paul Cartwright's casket, if he hadn't guessed the truth from the very beginning, where would the detective have ended up? When Michael discovered the reality, he was adamant about visiting Louise the very next morning, despite feeling weak. By nightfall, she had made her way to Sunnyside, under Claire's attentive care, while her mother had gone to Barbara Fitzhugh's. I never learned what Michael said to Mrs. Cartwright, but I am certain he was both considerate and gallant. That was just his nature with women. Unfortunately, Michael and Louise hadn't shared a single word until that evening. Claire and Jack, who I mean to say is really Alex, had taken a stroll, even though it was already 9 o'clock, and anyone with sense would have realized that the dew was settling in, and catching a summer cold was almost inevitable. At 9:30, tired of being alone, I went downstairs to locate the young couple. When I reached the living room door, I stopped short. Claire and Jack had returned, sitting close together on a divan with only one lamp lit. They didn't notice me, and I quickly retreated to the library. But once again I was sent back. Louise was nestled in a comfortable chair, the happiest I had ever seen her, with Michael right beside her, his arm around her shoulder. It was hardly a fitting scene for an elderly spinster. I retreated to my sitting room upstairs and retrieved Eliza Kleinfelter's lavender slippers. Ah, well, it seemed that my hopes of playing the nurturing matron would soon be tucked away in camphor once more. The following day, I gradually learned the entire story. Paul Cartwright was burdened by a relentless obsession, a love for money. It was a common vice, but his passion for wealth was not driven by the things it could buy. He desired it simply for its own sake. A review of the financial records revealed no discrepancies during the past year while John had served as cashier. But in the time of the previous cashier, Anderson, who had passed away, there had been some peculiar manipulations in the accounts. The railroad situation in New Mexico had seemingly depleted the banker's personal fortune, and he was determined to restore it with one bold move. This bold move involved nothing less than pillaging the bank's securities, converting them into cash, and making a swift getaway. However, the law has a long reach. Paul Cartwright had clearly analyzed the situation thoroughly. Just as it was said that a good Indian was a dead Indian, so too was it believed that a truly safe defaulter was a dead defaulter. He devised a plan to fake his own death. Once the uproar died down, he would be free to enjoy his wealth in peace, wherever he chose. The first step in his scheme was to find an accomplice. He turned to Dr. Walker, exploiting the man's affection for Louise. Walker had a questionable moral compass, and with Louise being the bait, Paul Cartwright quickly ensnared him. The plan seemed almost absurdly simple. A small western town, a faked heart attack, and a body from a medical school's dissection lab sent in a trunk to Dr. Walker from a colleague in San Francisco passed off as the deceased banker. What could be easier? But then a complication arose with a woman named Nina Carrington. She was the loose thread in the scheme. What she suspected, or what she truly knew, we never discovered. Employed as a chambermaid at the hotel in C, it was clear she intended to extort Dr. Walker. At that time, he found himself in a precarious position. Paying her off would imply guilt. He adamantly denied any wrongdoing, which prompted her to approach Michael. This confrontation was what had drawn Michael to the doctor the night he vanished. He accused the doctor of the trickery, and as he crossed the lawn, he uttered a cruel remark to Louise. Furious over her apparent betrayal, he headed for the station. Dr. Walker and Paul Cartwright, who still limped from the injury I had inflicted, hurried across to the embankment, knowing only one thing. Michael must not inform the detective of his suspicions until they had removed the money from the chimney room. They stepped into the road to block the car, and luck was on their side. The car collided with the train, leaving them to quickly deal with the unconscious body in the street. They did as I have described. For 3 days, Michael lay bound hand and foot in the boxcar, suffering from extreme thirst and lapsing into delirium, only to be discovered by a vagrant in Johnsville, just in time to save his life. Now, regarding Paul Cartwright, his plans had been thwarted at the last moment. Sunnyside, with its treasure hidden in the chimney room, had been rented out without his knowledge. After failing to remove me, he resorted to breaking into his own house. The ladder in the chute, the burning of the stable, and his entry through the cardroom window were all acts of desperation to access the chimney room. Louise and her mother had always posed significant obstacles. The intention had been to send Louise away until it was too late for her to interfere, but she returned to the hotel at the worst possible moment. A dreadful confrontation ensued. The girl was told that such actions were necessary, that the bank was about to close, and that her stepfather had to avoid arrest and ruin or risk taking his own life. Fanny Cartwright, although weak-willed, was her mother. Louise, on the other hand, was far more difficult. She harbored no affection for her stepfather, yet her love for her mother was unwavering and selfless. Caught off guard by her mother's pleas and overwhelmed by the situation, the girl ultimately relented and ran away. From somewhere in Colorado, she sent an anonymous telegram to Jack Morgan at the Traders Bank. Caught in her predicament, she couldn't bear the thought of an innocent man being arrested. The telegram she received on Thursday had sent the cashier into a frenzy that very night. When Louise arrived at Sunnyside, she discovered that the house was rented out. Unsure of what to do next, she sent for Arnold at the Greenwood Club and shared part of what was troubling her. She mentioned that something was amiss, that the bank was on the brink of closing, and that his father was involved. However, she withheld any mention of the conspiracy. To her surprise, Arnold already had some inkling of the situation, having learned from Morgan that night that things were not as they should be. He even suspected, though Louise did not, that the missing money was hidden at Sunnyside. He possessed a scrap of paper that hinted at a concealed room somewhere in the house. His inherited greed was awakened. Wanting to get Michael and Jack Morgan out of the house, he headed to the east entry, and in the billiard room handed the cashier something he had declined earlier that evening, the address of Paul Cartwright in California, along with a telegram that had been forwarded to the club from Dr. Walker. It was a reply to a message Morgan had sent, stating that Paul Cartwright was gravely ill. Morgan was nearly frantic. He made plans to head west to find Paul Cartwright and force him to pay up. But the disaster at the bank came sooner than he had anticipated. Just as he was about to leave for the west, at Andrews Station, where Mr. Hartley had arranged for the car, he learned that the bank had closed, and he returned to surrender himself. John Morgan had known Paul Cartwright well and was convinced the money wasn't truly gone. It simply seemed impossible given the short time since the securities had been taken. Where could it be? A passing remark made by Arnold Cartwright at dinner months ago led Morgan to believe there was a hidden room at Sunnyside. He attempted to speak with the building's architect, but like the contractor, if he was aware of any such room, he refused to share any information. It was Michael's idea for John Morgan to come to the house as a gardener so he could quietly carry out his investigations. With a subtle change in his look, just a trim from a local barber and a simple change of clothes, his smooth upper lip served him well as a disguise. It was Alex, Jack Morgan, who had been haunting us all along. Not only had he scared Louise and himself, as he confessed on the circular staircase, but he was the one who had broken through the wall in the trunk room, sending Eliza into a fit of hysteria. The note Emily found in Claire's scrap basket was from him, and it was he who had startled me into unconsciousness by the clothes chute, later carrying me to Louise's room with Claire's help. Claire, I discovered, had kept a vigil beside me all night, terribly anxious about my condition. There was no doubt that old Thomas had seen his master and believed he had encountered the ghost of Sunnyside. His account of seeing Jack Morgan on the path between the club and Sunnyside, the same night Emily and I heard the commotion on the circular staircase, was accurate too. The night before Arnold Cartwright was murdered, Jack Morgan made his first attempt to search for the secret room. He swiped Arnold's keys from his room at the club and entered the house, using a golf club to tap against the walls. He stumbled into a hamper at the top of the stairs, got his cufflink caught in it, and dropped the golf club with a loud crash. Relieved to escape without raising an alarm, he took the owl train back to town. What struck me as odd was that Mr. Hartley had known for some time that Alex was actually Jack Morgan. But the look on the false gardener's face was truly unsettling when that night in the card room the detective confronted him, saying, "How long are you, and I going to keep up this little charade, Mr. Bailey?" Well, it's all behind us now. Paul Cartwright rests in Casanova churchyard, and this time there's no doubt about it. I attended the funeral because I needed to see for myself that he was truly buried. I looked at the ledge of the grave where I had sat that night and questioned if it all actually happened. Sunnyside is up for sale now, but I won't be buying it. Little Lucian Cartwright is living with his step-grandmother, who is slowly recovering from the turmoil that marred her second marriage. Anne Watson rests not far from the man she killed, who, without a doubt, caused her own demise. Thomas, the fourth victim of that conspiracy, is laid to rest on the hill. With Nina Carrington, 5 lives were lost in this dreadful scheme. There will be 2 weddings coming up soon, and Emily has asked to wear my heliotrope poplin to the church. I knew she would. She has been wanting it for 3 years, and she looked quite dreadful when I accidentally spilled coffee on it. It's just the 2 of us now, in our quiet bubble. Emily still clings to her ghost theory, pointing out my soggy, muddy boots in the trunk room as evidence. I'm turning grey, I admit, but I haven't felt this good in over a decade. Sometimes, when I'm feeling bored, I summon Emily, and we chat about things. When Warner married Rosie, Emily scoffed, claiming Rosie's supposed loyalty was nothing but sentimentality. I haven't been able to shake off Emily's disdain since I gifted them silver cutlery for their wedding. So we sit and talk, and every so often Emily threatens to leave, and sometimes I dismiss her, yet somehow we remain together. I'm considering renting a house next year, and Emily insists I make sure there are no ghosts. To be honest, I never really lived until that summer. Time has elapsed since I began this narrative. My neighbors are getting ready for another summer. Emily is having the awnings put up and the window boxes filled. Whether Emily is with me or not, I plan to put an ad out tomorrow for a house in the countryside, and I don't care if it has a circular staircase. The End. This concludes The Cartwright Murder by Merrick Sharp, narrated by Chris Michelson. Published by brooksaudiobooks.com. All rights reserved. No portion of this audiobook may be reproduced in any form without written permission of the publisher. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks, and be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released.